There is a specific kind of Tuesday night almost everyone here has lived through. You come home late, open the fridge, and out of habit you grab whatever's fastest. Something wrapped in plastic that promises to be ready in 90 seconds. You eat it standing at the counter, and within the hour your stomach is doing something between cramping and complaining. That bloated, heavy discomfort that makes you loosen your waistband and wonder, quietly, what is actually happening inside you? This has happened to nearly everyone, and nearly everyone reaches for the same kind of food the next night too, simply because nobody ever explained what a stocked, old-fashioned kitchen already understood 100 years ago without a single lab test to prove it. Now sit with this for a moment, because it reframes almost everything. The foods that actually calm a difficult gut were never the ones sold as gut health products with a green label and a premium price tag. Most of what genuinely feeds and repairs the trillions of bacteria living in your digestive tract has existed quietly in ordinary kitchens for centuries, costs next to nothing, and simply stopped being talked about once convenience food became easier to reach for than the crock on the counter. Long before anyone had heard the word microbiome, most households understood something simple. What you ferment, what you let sit, and what you grow yourself changes how your body handles food for the rest of the week. That knowledge traveled the way most kitchen knowledge travels. Grandmother to mother, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor over a fence or a market stall. Not because anyone was selling anything, but because it worked well enough to be worth repeating for generations. A great deal of that knowledge quietly faded once packaged. Shelf-stable versions became easier to grab than the fermenting crock in the pantry corner. Tonight we're bringing 15 of those foods back into the light, with what they're genuinely shown to do, not what a label promises. Sauerkraut is probably the most overlooked of the 15, mostly because people remember it as a hot dog topping rather than what it actually is. Raw cabbage transformed by lactic acid bacteria, primarily lactobacillus strains, during a slow fermentation that can take 2 to 4 weeks. Multiple studies on fermented vegetables have found measurable increases in gut microbial diversity after regular consumption, and the live cultures survive stomach acid far better when the sauerkraut is raw and unpasteurized, rather than the shelf-stable, vinegar-brined jar most grocery stores sell. Look for it refrigerated, not on the shelf, and check that the label says unpasteurized or raw, since heat processing kills the very bacteria you're buying it for. Kimchi works through a similar fermentation process, but brings something extra to the table. Alongside its own lactic acid bacteria, it typically contains garlic, ginger, and often gochugaru pepper. And a study in the Journal of Medicinal Food found regular kimchi consumption associated with improved markers of gut barrier function, the integrity of the intestinal lining itself. The traditional preparation ferments for at least several days at room temperature before refrigeration, and the sourer, more pungent jars, the ones many casual shoppers walk past assuming they've gone bad, are often the most microbially active. Kefir takes the fermentation idea into dairy, and it earns its reputation honestly. Traditional kefir grains can contain over 30 distinct bacterial and yeast strains, a broader range than most yogurts. And research published in the Journal of Dairy Science found kefir improved lactose digestion even in people who were otherwise lactose intolerant, since the fermentation process partially breaks the lactose down before you ever drink it. A good kefir should taste distinctly tangy and slightly effervescent. If it tastes flat and simply sweet, the live cultures have likely been minimized or pasteurized out entirely. Live culture yogurt deserves a moment of its own distinction here, because most yogurt on shelves today is heat-treated after culturing, which kills the very bacteria that made it worth eating in the first place. The label to look for says, live and active cultures, and ideally lists specific strains like Lactobacillus bulgaricus or Bifidobacterium alongside it. Plain, unsweetened yogurt with a slightly sour bite is doing genuine work. The sweetened, dessert-style versions have often had enough sugar added to feed less beneficial bacteria, right alongside the good ones. Garlic works differently than the fermented foods, through what's called a prebiotic effect rather than a probiotic one. It contains inulin, a fiber your own digestive enzymes can't break down, which travels intact to your colon and becomes food for beneficial bacteria already living there, particularly Bifidobacterium species. Research reviewing prebiotic fiber intake has consistently linked it to increased short-chain fatty acid production, compounds your gut lining actually uses as fuel. Crushing or chopping garlic and letting it sit for 10 minutes before cooking allows an enzyme reaction that preserves more of its beneficial compounds than tossing it straight into a hot pan. Onions carry that same inulin fiber, often in even higher concentration than garlic, and here's where casual shoppers miss something important. The outer layers and the parts closest to the root, the ones most likely to get trimmed away and discarded, contain a meaningfully higher concentration of beneficial compounds than the tender inner layers people usually save. A grandmother who tossed onion skins into a simmering broth rather than the compost bin wasn't wasting nothing. She was extracting exactly what modern research now confirms was concentrated there. Leeks belong in the same family and offer a milder, sweeter way to get similar prebiotic fiber into a meal, particularly useful for anyone who finds raw garlic and onion too sharp for a sensitive stomach. The white and light green parts carry most of the usable fiber, while the tough, dark green tops are better saved for stock rather than eaten directly. Asparagus is one of the more concentrated natural sources of inulin among common vegetables, and the what casual shoppers miss detail here is timing. Asparagus loses a meaningful portion of its fiber content and flavor compounds within just a few days of harvest, so the thin, tightly closed tips and firm, non-wrinkled stalks at a farm stand or early in the week at a grocery store are doing considerably more nutritional work than the softer, older bunches sitting toward the back of a shelf. Oats bring a different kind of fiber into the conversation entirely. Beta-glucan, a soluble fiber that forms a gel-like substance in your digestive tract, slowing digestion and feeding a specific range of beneficial bacteria associated with short-chain fatty acid production. Steel-cut and rolled oats retain more of this fiber structure than instant oats, which are processed enough to break down some of that beneficial gel-forming capacity before it ever reaches your bowl. Green, slightly underripe bananas contain something most people don't associate with fruit at all: resistant starch, a type of starch that resists digestion in the small intestine and arrives intact in the colon, where it ferments slowly and feeds beneficial bacteria, much like fiber does. As a banana ripens and turns fully yellow with brown spots, that resistant starch converts to regular sugar, meaning the greener banana, the one most people pass over at the store waiting for it to ripen, is doing more gut-feeding work in its underripe state than it will once it's sweet. Apples carry pectin, a soluble fiber concentrated particularly in the peel, along with a polyphenol called quercetin that's been studied for its interaction with gut bacterial populations. The instinct to peel an apple before eating it removes a significant portion of both compounds. Eating it unpeeled, well-washed, keeps considerably more of what makes an apple genuinely useful here. Lentils and other legumes combine two mechanisms in one food. They contain both soluble fiber and their own form of resistant starch, particularly once cooked and then cooled, a process that increases resistant starch content measurably compared to eating them hot immediately after cooking. A pot of lentils made a day ahead and reheated is, in this narrow sense, more beneficial than one eaten fresh off the stove. Fennel has a long tradition across Mediterranean and South Asian households, specifically as a post-meal digestive aid, and the mechanism holds up. Its compound anethylate has documented antispasmodic effects on intestinal smooth muscle, easing the cramping and tightness that can follow a heavy or difficult meal, which is why chewing fennel seeds after eating remained common across cultures that otherwise shared very little culinary overlap. Miso, a fermented soybean paste central to Japanese cooking, contains live bacterial cultures, similar in principle to sauerkraut and kimchi, though heat destroys them quickly, which is why traditional preparation adds miso to soup only after it's removed from direct heat, stirred in once the broth has cooled slightly below a boil. Miso added to a still boiling pot loses much of its probiotic value before it ever reaches the bowl. Ground flaxseed rounds out the 15, with a combination of soluble fiber and compounds called lignans, which some research has associated with beneficial shifts in gut bacterial composition. Whole flax seeds largely pass through the digestive tract undigested, seed coat intact, which is why grinding them fresh, ideally within a day or two of use, since ground flax oxidizes quickly, makes a meaningful difference in whether your body can actually access what's inside. Now, taking a moment to bring all 15 back together, the sauerkraut and kimchi doing their slow fermented work, the kefir and live yogurt carrying dozens of bacterial strains into your gut directly, the garlic, onion, leek, and asparagus quietly feeding the bacteria already living there. The oats and lentils offering fiber your own enzymes can't break down, but your gut bacteria can. The green banana holding onto its resistant starch before ripening changes everything. The apple's peel and the fennel's calming seeds. The miso stirred in gently rather than boiled, and the flaxseed ground fresh rather than left whole in the bag. None of this requires a supplement aisle. It requires a slightly different way of shopping, and a little patience with fermentation and timing. Here's the part that stings a little. There was never much money in teaching people that a jar of raw sauerkraut costing under $4 does more for gut bacteria than a $50 probiotic supplement with flashier packaging and a celebrity endorsement. Processed convenience foods profit enormously from a shopper who doesn't know that a green banana or an unpeeled apple is doing real work. Shelf-stable, pasteurized versions of traditional ferments are cheaper to produce and easier to sell at scale than the raw, refrigerated versions that actually retain live cultures. Somewhere along the way, that chain of kitchen knowledge, grandmother to mother to daughter, quietly broke. Not because any of it stopped working, but because teaching it stopped being profitable for anyone positioned to keep repeating it. You don't have to guess anymore. It was never hidden. It just stopped being said out loud in most kitchens. So here's what's worth trying this week. Pick 3 or 4 of these 15, not all at once, and build them into meals you already make. Raw sauerkraut alongside dinner a few nights a week. A green banana instead of a ripe one for breakfast. Garlic crushed and rested for 10 minutes before it hits the pan. If there's a farmer's market or a small international grocer near you, the raw, unpasteurized versions of fermented foods and the freshest possible vegetables will genuinely outperform what you'll typically find pre-packaged on a standard grocery shelf. Notice honestly what changes and what doesn't, since some of these will matter more for your particular gut than others, and that's useful information, not a disappointment. Tell me in the comments which of these 15 you genuinely never heard the real reason behind before today, and if your own family has a fermenting or cooking trick passed down that you've never seen explained anywhere else, share it below. I read every single comment, and some of the best traditional food wisdom people have ever shared with me was never written down anywhere, just practiced quietly in someone's kitchen for decades, before anyone thought to ask why it worked. Since we've been speaking about what actually feeds the bacteria living inside you, the natural next step is looking at the foods that quietly undo this work just as effectively, the ones that starve those same bacteria or feed the wrong ones entirely, often hiding behind health claims on their own packaging. That's where we're headed next. Until then, the same slow ferments and patient gardens that fed your grandmother's kitchen are still available to yours, waiting only for a little more time and a little less packaging between you and them.